Hello, everyone. Welcome to How to Read Chinese Poetry podcast. I'm Zong-qi, the program host. In this podcast program, my colleagues and I aim to introduce cutting-edge scholarship on Chinese poetry to a broad general audience. We will present 52 episodes covering the major poetic genres developed over China's long history. Each episode features close reading of one or more of the best-known Chinese poems, with an aim to illuminate their literary greatness and cultural significance. For all the discussed poems, Chinese text, English translation, romanization, and brief notes are provided at our website, howtoreadchinesepoetry.com. By following the 52 episodes, listener will gain a bird's-eye view of the thematic, formal, and generic evolution of Chinese poetry from antiquity to the modern era. Instruct and delight is what we wish to accomplish in each talk. Without further ado, let's begin. Today, our guest host, Professor Bender, will present episode 24, entitled Xie Lingyun's Mountains and Waters. Let us welcome Professor Bender.
Last episode, I suggested that Tao Qian's poetry of fields and gardens was groundbreaking in the concreteness of its landscapes and in the seriousness with which it considered the relationship between humans and the natural world. Yet Tao's poetry is not always thought of as true landscape poetry, since it focuses primarily on the nearby rural margin between human society and the wilderness, rather than the more completely natural spaces far beyond the outskirts of human civilization. Tao had to write of this rural margin because that was where his limited material means allowed him to make a life for himself. His younger contemporary, Xie Lingyun, however, had a considerably wider experience of South China's dramatic landscapes, and the poetry he wrote amidst those landscapes is often considered the paradigm example of what later came to be called shanshui, the poetry of mountains and waters. Xie began to write extensively about landscape in 422, when the founding emperor of the Liu-Song dynasty, fresh off his overthrow of the Jin house, exiled him to administer the far-off seaside province of Yongjia. Thus banished from the capital and from capital society, Xie wrote poetry along the rugged but scenic route that proclaimed his fall a fortunate one, an opportunity to commune with wonders and with metaphysical truths that were closer to the surface the further one got from the false gaudiness of the court. The following poem, for instance, is one of Xie's earliest landscape verses. Like many of his poems, it ends with a compressed and somewhat cryptic evocation of the lofty and mysterious truths Xie has discerned from his engagement with the landscape. Truths that must by necessity remain somewhat difficult for us as readers to appreciate if we have not made the same journey.
Fuchun Isle. By night I cross Yupu Pool, at dawn to reach the walls of Fuchun. Mount Ding is far off in clouds and mists. At Red Pavilion there is no berth. Going against the current, lashed by its startled hurrying. Overlooking the bank, I'm blocked by its jaggedness. Clearly, I lack Bohun's endowment, and the dangers here surpass Lulang Gorge. But what comes continuously, one should become used to. In doubled mountains, stopping and lodging is right. All my life, I've had an affinity for plans of reclusion. But floundering and stumbling, I've been trapped by my feeble weakness. For a long time, I sought position and emolument. Now I begin to fulfill my pledge to travel far. My long suppressed aims are gradually unfolding. All human business withers and falls away. Since what I hold within is bright and expansive, beyond things, I am merely doing inchworm and dragon.
This poem begins by announcing the poet's itinerary. He is making a daring night journey, arriving at dawn at the outpost on Fuchun Isle. He starts out looking back over his shoulder towards his estates and the capital region, and the name of the mountain he sees looming over them in the distance, Mount Ding or Mount Stable, mocks the lack of stability he is experiencing in his exile. The journey is perilous, and the lashing waters and the jagged bank make him worry that he does not have the temperament for undergoing such dangers. Yet after he remembers stories of people who could retain their equanimity amidst hardship, stories drawn from the Zhuangzi, an ancient Taoist classic that often extols the virtues of reclusion, Xie's perspective begins to shift. He sees in the river's currents coming continuously an image from the water hexagram of the I Ching, or the classic of changes, and he remembers that the sagely authors of that text prescribe in such a situation learning to accommodate oneself to danger. And looking up, he sees layer on layer of mountains, the form precisely of the mountain hexagram in the same classic of changes, which advises going into reclusion when times get tough. Having now seen in the landscape the teachings of China's ancient sages, Xie begins to reconsider the reluctance and fear this journey to Yongjia initially inspired in him. Hadn't he always wanted to leave the sordid human world behind? Hadn't he always yearned to be a lofty recluse, freeing his mind by giving up concern for court rank and privilege? By the end of this poem, Xie is positively looking forward to his exile. He would, as it turned out, spend much of his time in Yongjia enjoying himself, exploring and writing poetic descriptions of its gorgeous landscapes. After about a year there, however, Xie grew tired of Yongjia and decided to claim illness as a pretext for giving up his official career and returning to his massive estate at Shining in the modern-day prefecture of Shaoxing in Zhejiang. Xie was the inheritor of two of the most storied aristocratic lineages of the 4th century, and his estate consisted of a large tract of mountainous landscape, with multiple mountain lodges, each supplied by a small army of servants that Xie also employed to open up trails for his rambles through untracked wilderness. Over the next several years, he wrote extensively of the impressive landscapes of his estate, proclaiming to the human world in poems that were greedily circulated in the capital that none of its denizens had the spiritual capacity to join Xie in his often mystic appreciation of the mountains and waters on his lands. As we saw in Fuchun Isle, Xie's poetry is often characterized by precise symmetries of mountain and water, suggesting that the landscape he sees is in some sense cosmically complete, containing balanced opposites of stability and fluidity, opacity and clarity, rising up and sinking down, and suggesting, moreover, that he, Xie Lingyun, possessed both of the virtues mentioned by Confucius when he remarked that the wise take joy in waters while the virtuous take joy in mountains. The poetry that Xie wrote during this period of reclusion on his estate also continues the dense elusiveness and the cryptic language of Fuchun Isle, often leaving his readers bewildered at the ends of his poems, as if to demonstrate how his experience in the landscape had raised him to rarefied spiritual states far above those of the common reader back in the human world. Much of Xie's verse, from the roughly 7 years he spent on his estate at Shining after returning from Yongjia, remains among the most famous and most beautiful landscape verse in the Chinese language. This is very great poetry, but it is a poetry that is fundamentally enabled by the servants Xie never bothers to mention, and that he takes for granted when he laughs in one of his poems at those sorts of recluses who, like Tao Qian, actually had to work the land in order to make a living. In this sense, though Xie's landscapes are far more dramatic, more stirring, and often more beautiful than the humbler fields and gardens that filled the verse of Tao Qian, the poetry he wrote in the comfortable years he spent on his estate can sometimes begin to seem hollow. In 430, however, Xie was exiled once again, this time even further south, first to modern-day Fuzhou in Jiangxi, and then, after about a year, even further to modern-day Guangzhou. On these journeys, separated from his estate and from the army of servants he had there, he broke out of his accustomed patterns to write a poetry far more haunting than any he had written before. The following poem is one of my personal favorites.
Entering Huizi Ridge, the third valley of Hemp Stream. It's true, the southern provinces have fiery virtue. Cassia trees rise over wintry mountains. Copper Hill shines in emerald torrents. A red spring pours over stone steps. This place lured an immortal to visit, and its perched worthies flown from the world. Its precarious paths cannot be measured. The road to heaven is no city street or country lane. Following it, I climb to the head of the many mountains. Far in the distance, I rise into clouds and mist. But the feathered people have cut off their traces. Cinnabar Mound is just an empty fish trap. Their diagrams and documents have all been destroyed, and who has heard of them carving stone steles? Nothing can be made out after 100 generations, so how could we know what happened 1,000 years ago? For a while, then, I'll carry out my intention of going off alone, in moonlight, playing with the slow-flowing water. Its permanence supplies the needs of this brief moment. Has in fact it always been this way?
The arc of this poem is almost diametrically opposed to that of Fuchun Isle. In Fuchun Isle, Xie had begun the journey with fear and reluctance, but his encounter with the landscape intimated to him that he was on the right path. In this poem, by contrast, he begins his climb of Huazi Ridge with great anticipation, remembering that the immortal Huazi had supposedly ascended to heaven from its peak. At the outset, moreover, everything seems propitious, as Xie had learned to expect from the ancient poem Yuanyou, or Far Roaming from the Chuzi, which describes a journey towards transcendence. This southern mountain bore on its sides flourishing cassias symbolizing immortality by not withering in winter. The streams that flow from its summit, moreover, appear to be filled with jewels, and its springs flow red, possibly with cinnabar, the key ingredient of the elixir of immortality. Yet when Xie arrives at the summit of the mountain, he finds nothing. There's no trace of the immortal Huazi, and nothing to teach Xie the secrets of immortality. And this matters to Xie, because he knows he will probably die in this exile, as in fact he would, sentenced to execution in the marketplace in 433. Finding no trace on Huazi Ridge of the techniques of immortality, Xie realizes, looking out from its peak, that all he has of this world is a brief moment in it. The mountain will remain and the moonlight will return night after night, but like everyone else who has ever lived, his time is fleeting. Insofar as Xie attains through his exploration of the landscape here a new and deeper understanding, entering Huazi Ridge represents a continuation of the poetic patterns that had defined his landscape poetry since the time of his first exile to Yongjia. At the same time, though, it also represents a reversal of those same poetic patterns and of the significance that had animated them. What Xie realizes in this late poem is no longer a truth accessible from his lofty perch in the mountains, but too elevated for those groundling denizens of the human world. Instead, it is a truth he shares with the human world from which he has been exiled. The mountains and rivers beyond the capital region are beautiful, no doubt, and they can supply the needs of the moment. But they keep their secrets hidden, even from the greatest poets who pass through.
Let us thank Professor Bender for such a stimulating talk. We look forward to his presentation of episode 25, the last episode of his topic, next Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Let's relax and listen to a reading of the poems in Mandarin.
谢灵运，富春主诗。萧寂于浦潭，淡极复春郭。定山免云雾，赤庭无烟波。溯流触荆棘，灵旗阻参错。亮伐薄昏分，险过吕梁壑。渐至一变习，尖山桂枳托。平生携幽期，轮至困微弱。九路甘露请，十国远游诺。夙兴渐深血，万事俱零落。怀抱既招旷，外物图龙祸。入华子冈是麻园第三古诗，谢灵运。南州石岩德，桂树临寒山。铜铃应碧剑，石凳谢红泉。既往引轮客，一期肥顿闲。险境无测度，天路非数千。遂登群峰首，渺若生云烟。与人绝仿佛，丹丘图空泉。途迭复磨灭，碑板谁闻传？莫辨百代后，安知千载前？且身独往矣，乘月弄禅园。横冲俄请用，岂为古今然。